All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm so sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties with Zoom. Finally got everybody here, thank goodness. So again, I apologize for the delay in getting this started. But thank you all for joining us here with Denise from Fermentis. We're really excited about this webinar. Fermentis has been a longtime sponsor and supplier of ADI, and I first want to thank them for their continued support of the craft spirits industry and ADI. I think if you've been to an ADI show, you know who Denise is. But she's we're thrilled to have her presenting today on the Distilling the Essence. She's the technical sales support manager for Fermentis. She brings 30 plus years of brewing and distilling experience, supporting distillers across America with her deep fermentation experience. She's crafted award-winning beers, helped develop whiskey washes, and even served as master and brewmaster in Germany for Weyermann Specialty Malts. I might have butchered that name, and I apologize if I did.
Perfectly perfect.
Oh, hey, there we go.
Yes.
So, a couple of housekeeping things. While she's presenting, if you're having trouble seeing her presentation, in the upper right-hand corner, there is a little view tab, and you can change how the view is so you can kind of blow up her presentation more, so you can see that. I'm gonna duck backstage. I'll still be here to kind of monitor the Q&A and the chat. Denise, do you want to do Q&A at the end and save them all for then, or do you want to?
Yeah, I would like to do that. And I'm just gonna go over so if I hit the share button, then it'll want to pick up my
Yeah, you hit that share button, you'll be able to choose what you want to share.
okay, I'm ready to go.
All right, I'm gonna jump in the back and I'll monitor the Q and A. But like I said, we'll save the Q and A for at the end of the presentation. So if you guys have any questions or have any trouble, hit me up in the chat. Just start putting your stuff into the Q and A form. Denise, it's all yours.
Okay, super. Hey, thanks, Brandon, for the fine introduction. I really appreciate this platform to discuss some of the things that some of us are curious about. Fermentis does a pretty good job of looking into some of the spirits that we produce and going into a deeper dive with some technical knowledge. And we do spend quite a bit of money in research and development, not only of our products but other new and exciting, interesting things. So when we started to put together this particular bourbon malt whiskey parallel trial system, we really found some really kind of neat nuggets. And we just started with phase one, so we're working to develop a phase two to go into some different things. But this basically is the phase one presentation of the two comparative fermentations. And basically, this is what we came up with. Introduction of it is, processing for malt whiskey production. A lot of us know how malt whiskey is produced. It's not exactly perfectly in this process, but many of us know that we have a grain intake and malted barley, processed water, milling to a slurry tank. There's some conversion done, typically separation in malt whiskey, and that's kind of what gives malt whiskey some differentiation in how it's fermented and how it's the flavor kind of is construed later on. And cooling, fermentation, obviously important to us, distillation after that, and maturation, and typically blending of these types of products is very popular. Processed water typically is a nice source. It doesn't have a lot of minerality to it. It can impact the flavor profile, as we know. Water is typically processed with free of iron, but it might have a little bit of differentiation in the water chemistry. Typically, they use 100% malted barley. They also use a roller mill instead of a mill that's going to pulverize it a little more. They want to keep that grain intact like a brewer would, so they can separate that and use that grain. They want to crack it open. They want to expose the starch. They want to use that husk as a filtration bed, so they can really rinse all of those sugars off of that grain to get their wort or their brewer's beer to be able to move it to brewer's beer. The separation of the extract from the solids, very important. In some of the Japanese whiskeys, they even take it even further to clear the turbidity out and really make it as clean as possible with centrifuge in a lot of cases. So basically, they want to have that starch conversion, typically, especially in Scotland, without any exogenous enzymes. They try and make sure that it's traditional with 100% malted barley. Outside of Scotland, you might see enzyme use. There's a lot of traditionalists out there, but sometimes you might find somebody that will use some enzyme use. Taking conversion and the separation out of that, that's what some people do too. They might actually ferment some of these 100% barleys on grain too. And I've seen a lot of that in the American single malt category as we venture into talking about that later on. Some, the sky's the limit, but you do need to know after we talk about some of these processes that there will be some differentiation in flavor for sure. So on the grain processing for bourbon production, it's a little bit different. We know that we've got this intake, we've got unmalted cereals and milling in a slurry tank on one side. And on the other side, we might have malted barley and a different milling in a slurry tank. And sometimes they're all put together and sometimes they're adapted separately because the unmalted cereals typically need to go into a cooker process to hydrolyze them and to homogenize everything and get it at a high temperature to break that in liquefaction, break those, compact starches and open them up and to let some of the natural enzymes from the barley that are going to come over to be able to break that down. So typically you'll have this reverse temperature mashing, the hot temperature in the cooker, and as the temperature starts to drop, different grains come in with their independent conversion temperatures, rye usually next. And then that slurry tank kind of keeps everything homogeneous at the temperatures a little bit lower for barley conversions. A lot of times in bourbon, you're going to see exogenous enzymes because they're looking for efficiency. They want to make sure that they get everything out of the parts and pieces that they've put into it. Then that's that conversion area. After that, you typically don't see separation, but some people will separate after that. They'll either run it through some sort of sieve or something like that to really kind of reduce some of the grain and turbidity, but most often you see fermentations on grain in bourbon process. Cooling, fermentation, distillation, maturation, some blending. There's a lot of blending out there. There's a lot of marriage and marrying out there. So there's a lot of different ways that your bourbons are going to be produced in the final frontier. Grain percentages typically in the United States are according to the regulation of the style. Obviously, bourbon has its manifestations and rye whiskeys do too. So we always want to remain within the guidelines of style. Usually 10 to 20% malted barley for those conversions of starch. Water, again, iron-free, hammer mill typically to make sure everything's pulverized mechanically so there isn't any doubt that you're going to expose all of that starch for conversion to sugar. Typically no separation. And the backset and stillage quotient is something kind of unique and interesting. Typically you will find some of these people doing sour mashes instead of just what they call a sweet mash. And what they'll do is they'll add 15 to 25% of stillage from the previous distillation back into the fermentation to help drop the pH, help with some nutritional value in some of the desiccated yeast that's in that mixture, as well as maintaining some temperature and not dumping as much down the drain from batch to batch. So there's really, handful of reasons why people would use this. And in dropping that pH, the hope is that it would keep the bacteria at bay. So in the old days, that's what they thought. They had this great idea. And as we figure it out, it really kind of changes the way that these products come out in flavor and in characteristic. Not bad, just different. Yeah. So again, the backset could be optional. You could work with some different, acidifying agents if you want to. I know citric is popular, lactic, not so much. But, in lieu of a backset operation, which could cost a lot of infrastructure money and usually isn't that easy to do unless you have that infrastructure set up. So separation would be out and questions to be answered by the study. So with the study, we wanted to see how fermentation and congener production differ on these different fermentation mashes. Mash fermentation same conditions for the most part, similar conditions in the parallel trials, but we wanted to see what the differences were. We also wanted to see which strains were more suitable for each substrate based on the fermentation and completion of the congener profile, see what we saw, and how can whiskey producers use these findings to make some selections and decide for themselves what type of characteristics that they might enjoy and have a vision for in their particular product. So the design of the experiment, okay, yeah, a lot of stuff here, but very similar side by side. So in the malt whiskey mash, we performed that over in Germany at the Technical University of Munich, and 16 different strains, typical mash separation, winter barley malt, ground with a tight spacing, processed on the smaller semi-automatic mashing system, and it resulted in slight differentiations from mash to mash to mash. But the fermentations were pretty aligned. There wasn't that much differentiation, just a little bit. Continuous stirring in these fermentations in these small flasks, 500 mils, and CO2 evolution determination for the kinetics on the weight determination. On the bourbon side, we did 20 different yeast strains, and we had a donated mash. So we used the same mash in different container, were frozen in different containers for these particular fermentations. Similarly, they were in same temperature. The bourbon mash itself was 78 corn, 12 rye, 10 malted barley, 20% backset, but we didn't use any enzyme in this. So in both sides of the study, no enzyme was put in. The kinetics, again, an ANCOM system, similar continuous monitoring of the gas and the kinetic form after that. Fermentation temperature was 28°C throughout both conditions. That was the single temperature condition on both sides. Pitching rates, 30 grams per hectoliter, unless it was a diastatic strain. We went for 50 grams per hectoliter with those particular strains. Pre-fermentation analysis, we analyzed the mashes, the pH, the density, the HPLC, and the carbs from the degree of polymerization from the single to the DP3s. We checked the fan, so we did that on both. We also, after the fermentations with HPLC and GCMS, the analysis of the volatile compounds, the residual sugars, the ethanol, the pH, and the organic acids. So on the side here, you can see that a little bit different kind of a temperature look from the malt to the bourbon, but in essence, those are kind of just a snapshot of what those schematics look like when you take a look at an example of a mash profile for both of these. So the analysis of the results, well, the mash profile comparison was a little bit different. And as we look at that, the unfermented malt versus the bourbon mash, basically the original gravities were a little bit different. So we kind of just looked at the apple for the apple and the orange for the orange. So we looked at the trial number 3 being kind of in the middle of the mean of all of these trials. So we saw a little bit of differentiation, but the mean was about 13.9. Same with the pH, a mean of 5.9. A glucose level of 13.1 was the mean, maltose a little higher, and maltotriose, there and available for the taking, but we know maltotriose is kind of last on the list for the yeast strains, so we wanted to make sure that we looked at those as well. On the bourbon mash side, we had a consistent, since it was the same mash throughout, we had a consistent 18.5 starting gravity. So we know that we had everything consistent in that. pHs were a little bit different. Maybe it was the pH meter, maybe it was because of the freezing unfreezing technique, thawing technique, but most of these pHs were about the same. Glucose level, the mean was 14.8. The maltose, the mean was 106, and the maltotriose, the mean was a little bit higher with these heavier sugars. So we knew that we had a little bit more work to do. And if you see a bourbon mash and you understand that it's going to have a little bit more of that, more difficult sugar to ferment, or even residual dextrins, that's where those enzymes tend to come in. And you can tell that the natural barley enzymes probably went to work on this a little bit at a greater clip. So fermented mash profile comparison. So we have residual sugars in the all malt and the bourbon fermentations. And we did name these yeast strains and coding, so you can kind of take a look and see which ones basically were in both. The malt mash, some residuals. We knew we had some that had some residual sweetness left over. Our controls pretty much were the same. And on the bourbon side, we had some that were the controls, were the ones that are in the box. And we had some variability, but for the most part, the controls, except for this one, looked pretty much the same. So we had a lot of independent differentiation. The malt mash didn't have a lot of residual sugars. Again, those enzymes and those natural barley enzymes versus no enzyme whatsoever and just the natural barley enzyme, the 10% that they had put in here. We had a lot of conversion, but we had a lot of residual sugars. Again, with enzymes, you would probably see these levels drop quite a bit when I added those in there. So those were the bourbon yeast strains. So on the glycerol in the all malt and bourbon fermentation, we had basically considerably higher in the bourbon fermentation, as you can see over here. The fermentation was probably conditions, differences, higher nitrogen perhaps in the malt mash, higher gravities in the bourbon mash, lower pH in the bourbon mash due to the use of the back set. So it was a little more difficult for those yeast cells to ferment. And that's typically when you see glycerin spike or glycerol spike, that's when what you know is there's stressors involved. So the ABV is generally higher in these bourbon fermentations. So more stress, again, just kind of naturally develops because we had a higher gravity. We probably should have assumed that there was going to be a little bit more stress. And so a little bit more glycerol. So the ABV and the glycerol and the all malt and bourbon fermentations, obviously when we see that, we think, why is it that way? And why is it so, independently, even on the malt side, we're giving the malt side a little bit easier go of it for the yeast strains. So we know that there's a lot of conversion. We know that it's going to have, a lot more free amino nitrogen from all that malted barley compared to some of the other grists. And so we know it didn't put a lot of stress on it. Obviously that ABV and, having just more residual sugars put a lot of stress on it. Final pH, obviously we've got some differentiations in final pH, and notably the higher pHs are going to be in the all malt and the lower in the bourbon. And I think that's due to the back set. We lowered that pH in that initial mash fermentation. So we know that we're going to get a little lower pH on the finish. And some of the yeast strains actually went really, really low into the mid threes. So we're not considering that it was more bacteria. We're considering that that particular yeast strain actually lowered the pH a little bit more. So certain strains will do it independently different than other strains will. So you're starting to see some personality in the yeast strains themselves. The final pH, the differentiation. When we look at congener ratios, we look at ester and higher alcohol levels in the all malt versus the bourbon malt fermentations. The higher esters and alcohols seen in malt fermentations are, again, probably going to be due to that higher nitrogen level in all barley. Some of these strains showed nearly double the concentrations of higher alcohols and esters in both substrate fermentations. Again, the trait of the strain is starting to show itself, and indicatively kind of similarly in both fermentations, even though the amounts might be different. You kind of see some consistent traits with some of these strains. As far as the esters that we're going to demonstrate today, the isoamyl acetate, the ethyl acetate, and the higher alcohols of the propanol, isobutanol 3-M1B, and the phenyl ethyl alcohol. So you look at the controls of the BYO2 and the MYO1, and that was the control, but you can kind of see some differentiation in some of the higher alcohols, which would be represented on the bars here. And then the esters, some kind of really kind of all over the place with these different yeast strains. So here comes the personality and the trait of the strain coming out. at that one temperature. Now, obviously, as we dig into this in next phases, we're going to change some things up. We're going to have some different temperatures to consider, some different gravities to consider, some different pHs to consider. So we're going to kind of manipulate some of the conditions to see how conditions can affect these. But at these conditions, these similar conditions, we can kind of get a grasp on the trait of the strain, which was kind of interesting to me. Again, the higher alcohol is less in the bourbon strain, in the bourbon fermentations. It's not the strain's fault, it's the mash making it different, not by fault, but just by differentiation. And the ester levels were a little bit different, but you can see that certain strains, and they're not the exact strain from one predictable, the M's aren't the same codes as the B's, so they are different strains side to side. But you can see that there's some personality difference in some of these other ones too. Even though the higher alcohols are lower and the esters are lower, there's still some differentiation. And again, we're thinking that, the pH has a lot to do with the focus. And there's also the idea of being a separated mash versus an all grain mash. There's some differentiation of how the all grain mashes can ferment as well. And, particulate matter, the lipids, the yeast clinging to the grain. There's a lot of differences in the, just the dynamic of the fermentation itself too. So this was basically the averaged values, and it's pretty much the same thing that we just saw. Here's the malt and some total of the ester ratios, higher ratio esters to higher alcohols. And so you can see some different that's the same higher alcohols, the same esters, but it gives you kind of a ratio of what you're looking for. Now, when you're putting something in a barrel, that ratio is important because we're looking for a dynamic between how much ester that we've put into the barrel and how much higher alcohol that we've put into the barrel, so they can start those manipulations in their transesterifications later on in the barrel. And that ratio can be more important to certain climates, certain flavor profiles. We want, some, at least a layer of ester in there so we have something to transform. So you can't put it in there. You can't transesterify something if it's not really there to begin with. So those are kind of important to look at. And again, in the bourbon, a little bit lower, but some different dynamic in the ratio, and just difference in style, difference in yeast strain, and obviously difference in the substrate that we're fermenting. And there's that same ratio. So we wanted to compare the ethyl acetate produced by the select strains. And as we see here, it can be seen that most strains produce nearly 3 times more ethyl acetate in the malt fermentations when compared to the bourbon fermentations. We didn't measure YO6 in the malt mash fermentation, so that's why it only has, YO6 would be number 5 there. That's why it only has 1 figure. So the ethyl acetate here, basically, obviously more in the malt mash fermentations, higher esters. We saw that on the earlier profiles. And we know that, these separated 100% barley mashes are going to give us a little bit more aroma flavor profile. This ethyl acetate, that pineapple fruity banana that comes off really nicely toward the first part of your, after you've made your first cuts and you start getting into your heart section. So the ethyl acetate, these are the, obviously the malt versus the bourbon, same thing. Let's just go to this. The isoamyl acetate was nearly double in the quantity in the malt compared to the bourbon mash. And again, 06 wasn't measured. So, isoamyl acetate, more banana characteristic. Certain yeast strains are going to just really pump it out, and certain yeast strains are going to be a little bit more mellow with it. So this is really strain independent. As a whole, again, the malt mashes provided more characteristic in this and produced more of the isoamyl acetate, whereas the bourbon mashes far less. But you can see some dynamic with specific strains having the ability to produce more. The phenylethyl alcohol produced by the select strains, let's get the numbers up there, are comparable with about 10 to 15% reduction between the all malt. So not quite as much of a diversity in these fermentation contrasts. Again, YO6 wasn't measured, but you can see in certain fermentations that we don't have as much of a discrepancy. So that phenylethyl alcohol, those rose-like, violet-like notes that are so pleasant in some of these bourbons and some of these all malt whiskeys are really, really sublime. So if you're looking for something like that, we know that we have a couple of strains, especially this YO6 that's coming off in the bourbon that was substantially higher in those floral characteristics. And it's an alcohol, so it's on the alcohol side. It contributes not only to the floral characteristic, but also to those transesterifications later on in the barrel. So quite interesting to me that the phenylethyl alcohol was, predominant in a lot of these and really couldn't be amplified with a specific yeast strain. So our conclusions, well, what did we learn? We learned that the bourbon mash fermentations showed a higher level of residual sugars, of course, and glycerol, more stressful. It had a higher, starting gravity, it was on grain, lots more stress, lots more alcohol, lots more residual sugar because we didn't use any enzyme capability. We also learned there's a difference in performance of the same strains in the all malt fermentations versus the bourbon mash fermentations. So we saw a few strains with a higher degree of attenuation and ester production, but also that ester to alcohol ratio. We saw some differentiations in that. And the all malt fermentations showed a higher level of congener and better attenuation, obviously, nitrogen, more enzyme to go to work, less residual sugars. And, the substrate is just different in the way that it's portrayed. The ingredients make a lot of difference in the amount of free amino nitrogen that you have, the capability of the enzyme from the barley to break everything down. There is some difference, and that's why exogenous enzymes kind of come into play these days as far as, almost a necessary evil in certain efficiencies. The strains which showed a higher congener production were consistent in both masters. So the trait of the strain was pretty consistent. There might have been an amplified amount in one series, but very consistent and very similar in the bourbon mash too. We're going to unveil a little bit of this. We don't usually like to make things commercial, but I kind of wanted to give some people out there kind of a frame of reference as to what we were looking for and what we found in our own yeast strains, just so we could kind of understand ourselves what produced what in that single condition with those single mashes that we did. So for the ethyl acetate, the SAF Spirit C70 did really well in the malt for ethyl acetate, and bourbon, it had some, but not overwhelming amounts. The SAF Spirit M1 really produced a lot of ethyl acetate on the all malt mash. And on the bourbon mash, a safe amount, not overwhelming amount, but a notable amount. The YO7 was the EXP23, which we're going to release as a new product probably early next year. You'll probably see that in some advertisements, and the next show that you come to, we'll have it released. But it's a super fruity, floral, characteristic type of a yeast strain. With the EXP23, we found that the malt had some ethyl acetate, a good amount, and that the bourbon had some, but not overwhelming amount. And the USW6 in the all malt, again, a medium amount of ethyl acetate, and in the bourbon, a lower amount. On the isoamyl acetate, we found that the C70 really produced a lot of isoamyl acetate in the all malt fermentation. And in the bourbon, not so much. It was there, it was appreciable, but not as much. The D53, also with isoamyl acetate, it produced some, and it usually is known for isoamyl acetate, and it produced a substantial amount in the malt mash and not that much in the bourbon mash. But we'll tell you, side by side, D53, you're probably going to feel a lot more of that banana note in general. It's just known for its isoamyl acetate kind of production. In the HG1, we tried HG1 because we know a lot of American distillers will use this for a cleaner characteristic, and we know that it's doesn't provide a lot of flavor characteristic. It provided like absolutely no isoamyl acetate. It was really clean when it came out to that. So if you're looking to avoid isoamyl acetate, that might be a strain that could intrigue you either as a blended product or a single product. And back to the standard as the USW6 for the bourbon standard, it did not produce very much isoamyl acetate either. So typically bourbons, you're not going to find a lot of that, but in the malt whiskey, it did produce some of that. So we know that the higher the nitrogen, the higher the fermentability, that you're going to probably produce more of these congeners. With the phenylethyl alcohol, the Fermentis strains, the C70, again, really produced a lot in that malt. So if you're using C70 and you want to put it on an American single malt and you want to separate it, man, oh man, you might be producing some of those floral characteristics that can really be dynamic. Bourbon as well. We find a lot of this floral characteristic with this particular strain of the C70, and we know some distillers really prefer it. They might use it as blend, they might use it in single barrel notions, but they really enjoy those floral characteristics that really pop over. The D53, not a lot of the phenylethyl alcohol. It's not part of its strain characteristic. So there was a little bit in both mashes, enough to be measured, but not really appreciable to a great degree. The HG1, look at that, 3 times on that bourbon mash, it really overproduced on those phenylethyl alcohol notes. So there's 2 different strains that you might be able to evoke different floral characteristics in the phenylethyl alcohol from. And the USW6, we took a look at that for the all malt, and it did produce some in a really nice amount. And in the bourbon, very low. So it was there, it was appreciable, but it wasn't, dynamic like some of the other strains had done. So it was kind of interesting to me. This to me was kind of like the idea of knowing, in general from this one study. Now you can't really go crazy. We did take the 2, the apple and the orange, and we kind of managed to put them and identify them and characterize them at 10% by volume alcohol. So we moved the numbers into a 10% idea, and this is what we comparably found between the 2. So when the data was normalized and we took a look at this, it was really quite interesting to me to see, just the differentiation in flavor contrast of the same strain with just 1 different substrate, same temperatures, obviously different nitrogen and pH, but it was really kind of an eye-opener to me. So with that, I wanted to, I wanted to say thanks to everyone and show you our next steps. These selected strains, we're not going to take all of them from both sides. We're going to select probably 8 different strains and then run parallel trials again at TUM and Kentucky University. And they're going to be conducted from the similar laboratory scale, but we're going to change conditions this time. Variable fermentation from mimic the cases that we would see in a distillery environment, higher temperatures, lower temperatures, different pH alignments, maybe some different fan levels, bacterial load. That might be something that we might challenge some of these yeast strains with. But we're going to make some differentiations and then draw some different conclusions too. We're going to evaluate the effect of the strains on the parameters and select the different congener profiles with different parameters. So we as whiskey makers, you as a whiskey maker can find out really a basic understanding if I select this strain, these are the generalities that these strains are going to kind of perform in. So it's really kind of nice if we're trying to decide what our true north with our program is and some congener flavors that we can kind of set up for maturation and almost depend on them time and time again from a specific yeast strain. That's kind of what we're looking to do, is help you make a choice, make your choice, the best choice for the signature of your beverage. So I wanted to thank some people from the James Beam Institute, Dr. Tyler Barzee, Zach Bird, and Dr. Brad Barron. They were instrumental in helping on the bourbon side. I wanted to thank Dr. Thomas Becker, Jennifer Schneiderbanger, and Roland Kerpes for their intellect and their trial study over at the Technical University at Munich. And I also wanted to thank our research partners with Fermentis, Evelyn Fonchi-Penot, Yves Goslin, myself, and Krishna Rajiv. We all worked independently and to oversee these projects and to conduct these projects for Fermentis. And a lot of work was put in. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I hope that you enjoyed the basics. So far, so good, as far as um, being able to take a look at some of these things and manage your fermentations, give an idea of where you want to go, maybe take a look at the styles that we looked at, and maybe do some pilot trials. And I encourage you, if you do want to do some pilot trials, to give us a shout at Fermentis, and we'll see if we can come up with some trial format for you. Well, okay, now if I can get out of the stop sharing, I'll do that. And I suppose we have some time for some questions if Brandon wants to join back in, help me out. There you are. I can't hear you, Brandon. I can't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I do have a couple questions. If you guys have questions now, you can enter them in the Q&A or in the chat function, and we'll address them. So the first one came through from Kylie. She said, so the Sap Spirit M1 didn't produce any isoamyl acetate or phenol alcohol, or they weren't tested?
Well, they were tested, but what I will say is at the temperature of 28C, they didn't demonstrate an advantage as far as that's concerned. Now, that's what's going to be really important about the next phase. We start changing temperatures, we start changing some of the conditions. And I know that some of these yeast strains that didn't really go crazy at the 28-degree temperature will probably have variable conditions and variable data as we find out later on. I wouldn't say that in any condition that you can't evoke some of these things, but certain, M1 I know can get floral on you, and I know that it can get fruity on you. I think that playing around with nitrogen conditions, with temperature conditions, with pitching rates, that you can manipulate some of the characteristics with that. And that's, in general, this was just one snapshot, one laboratory snapshot of what it can do at one period of time in a moment. And I also know that, changing conditions is going to change those data figures as well. So don't give up on M1. I still think that we can evoke different characteristics from it and play around with, again, pitching rates, temperatures, pHs, and nitrogen levels. And I think that especially nitrogen levels, there's a lot of work in some of the nitrogen components that we can add as far as organic nitrogen that really open up those pathways to produce more ester content. So don't give up on it. There's strategies that we can help really try and figure out what the best flavor characteristic that you're looking for. So there are other ways to evoke flavor for sure.
So Celia asked, she said, sorry, which yeast did you say was being presented next year?
Well, it's the EXP23, and it's an experimental yeast strain that we've been trialing around the world in different countries for about 2 years. And it will be a diastatic strain. I'm not allowed to announce the name yet because we haven't officially announced it with Fermentis. But it will be a new floral, fruity whiskey strain that probably, I'm not going to say December because I don't think it's ready. The marketing's ready for that yet, but it's probably going to be Q1 when we release and announce a brand new strain. So if it is something that you want to try and trial, we still have some trial material that you can give it a go if you want to under the guise of an EXP23. But if you want to wait a couple of months on your trials, we'll have a brand new strain out for you to just purchase directly or for samples or what have you. It's exciting.
Question for me, Gregory. Yes. So I will get these slides from Denise, and this is also being recorded. So I will download this and edit it a little bit, and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. And I'll also send you all an email with these slides, with the link to the video. So you guys will have all that along with contact information for Fermentis. So yes, these will be made available to you. Celia, regarding the initial pH in the all malt, someone else entered a question, I lost it. In the all malt mash, Would you recommend something closer to 5.5 for fermentation?
Well, playing around with pH can change your fermentability for sure. I know a lot of brewers like to work within that 5.2, 5.5 range. So if you've got a brewer's mind, that's your zone. Depending on your water, you might get a little bit more than that. And pH is going to have a lot to do with fermentability and flavor, and that's where the trials come in. Is your starting pH. If you keep it consistent, you know what you're going to get empirically. If you start to lower the pH a little bit, you might not be as dynamic in some of your flavor context as was demonstrated in the pH changes. But there's so many other variables that can contribute to the behavior and the flavor characteristic of each strain. Again, nitrogen has a lot to do with it. In those all barley malts, you might lower the pH, but the nitrogen is still there. There's still a lot there, free amino nitrogen for those yeast to go crazy with. So it's the substrate has a lot to do with it. The complexities of the grist and what they donate as far as nitrogen, what they donate as far as residual sugars and what's left over. Again, pH can be one of the variables, but it doesn't have to be the only variable that can change things to the positive, or amplify something, or to diminish a characteristic that you're not as fond of.
Very good. Mervyn Krause said, "Thanks, old friend. We've been using the same yeast for our rum and single malt. We do like the amyl acetate in our rum, but it doesn't appear so much in the whiskey. What strain do you recommend?"
For which compound? Isoamyl?
Yeah.
Isoamyl?
The amyl
For
acetate is
Yep,
what he types.
yep. Amyl acetate, that would be that D53. That's usually its characteristic, and a lot of people use that for white dog a lot, because it's so fruity and so characteristically banana forward. The ethyl acetate, I would say M1 usually does a lot for that. But again, these conditions have a lot to do with it. The pH has a lot to do with it, and your nitrogen, especially nitrogen additions, and not just DAP. DAP is kind of like in the beginning, give me my crack cocaine and I'll get the party started. But it's the organic nitrogen that is the nutritional food that you take into your cells. That all of us are trying to be better humans, so we try and take better nutrition into our cells, and the cell of the yeast will do the same thing. It'll hold that proper nutrition inside of its cell, the organic nutrition, a little bit longer, and it keeps it in its reserves and waits for the rainy day, the end of the fermentation, to be able to utilize that. Now, if we manipulate those pathways with additional organic nutrition, we know that we can start to develop different esters with the right amino acids at the right time during the fermentation. So a lot of this work is done in winemaking, and we see a lot of differentiation in flavor and character in winemaking, and a lot of it can be translated with organic nutrition in any kind of fermentation, whether it be beer, whether it be any type of spirit, what have you. So that's kind of a frontier that you might want to look at, as far as if you don't want to change up your yeast strain, we can also kind of trial some different nutritional strategies to try and amplify certain characteristics.
Next question. Do you have any experience with this type of data when under pitching the yeast rates down to half or 1/8 the recommended amount?
That's what phase 2 is all about. We're going to, obviously under pitch normally, over pitch, and we're going to see the differentiation in characteristics as we move forward. We're designing the experimental right now as we speak, in the next couple of weeks. And then once we start the trials, we know we're going to have some different conditions and some different pitching rates to get more data from, and really understand a little bit more about under pitching. I know a lot of people under pitch out there in a large scale bourbon distillery. We found some significant under pitching, and then they wonder why I'm getting flavor indifferences. Why is this not working? Why is the bacteria taking over? So pitching the recommended amount typically is where your efficiency is going to lie. If you want to manipulate that a little bit for flavor, I understand that, but those recommendations are there for proper efficiency, proper amount of yeast cells for your fermentation. And obviously if you're working with higher gravities, you want to overpitch a little bit. You just want a healthy fermentation. I mean, that's really what you're looking for. If you're starting to starve the yeast a little bit, you're going to get more glycerol, and glycerol was going to be alcohol, but now it's glycerol. So those are the ideas that you want to kind of combat. If you're under pitching, you're going to see that glycerol spike quite a bit.
Very good. Do we have any more questions, comments for Denise?
Only good comments. I don't want to hear the bad ones. I don't want to hear that we were late. And we know we were late, and I'm very sorry about that.
That's right. Well, everyone who is still on, thank you so much for joining us. Denise, thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yep, here we go. In regards to nutrition, do you suggest nutrients?
Yeah, and all nutrients aren't created equal. So let's put it that way. I do suggest that. I mean, barley has a lot of nutrition. So if the more barley you use, the less likely you're going to have this mindset that I need to add more nutrition. But there are cases around the world where we see, really crops out there that are devoid of that nitrogen component, and we need to, help it. And the idea of, 10 or 12% barley converting every bit of sugar may or may not be a realistic one, and contributing a huge amount of the free amino nitrogen. I know corn has it, I know rye has it, but no one has as much as barley. So we know that, changing the differentiation in nitrogen too is going to be something that you can play with. And organic nitrogen, something that comes from the yeast cell, that's natural to the yeast cell, is typically going to be the better type of nitrogen that you're going to look for. And again, if samples or strategies is something you're looking for, please let us know, and we'll help work toward those goals with some benchtop trials and help you figure out what's best for your particular situation, because everybody's different for sure.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's no more questions. Denise, thank you again. Thank you to the fermentation team for being such strong voices and supporters in the craft spirits industry and in ADI. For all of you who are still on, if you are an ADI member, thank you so much for being a member. Our membership helps us be able to have the ability to do these webinars from both the supplier and the member side. So if you're on and you're not a member, you can look in the resources. You can join ADI, get you some awesome discounts, helps us support webinars like this. We're amping up. We're doing about 2 to 3 a month, I think all the way through February right now. So we're really loading them up. And this year we're going to start doing more of these supplier spotlight webinars as well, so you can hear directly from our suppliers and touch base with them if you don't get to talk to them at the conference. So Denise, thank you again so much. You guys, as always, are doing awesome work.
Thank you.
And with 2026, if you guys get our email, keep an eye out. We're making a big announcement here shortly on where we're going in 2026. I won't tell you, but Will Smith made a famous song about it. So that'll give you a little bit of a hint if you're from that era. So thank you again, everybody. As always, I will get these slides. I will get the video. We'll get that up on YouTube, and I will email you all the PDF of the slides and some contact information for Denise and other members of Fermentis that you might want to get a hold of. All right.
Terrific. Thanks again,
so much. Yeah.
Thanks again. Thanks to the ADI, and every year it gets better and better. I've been an ADI member since I would say, as far as I go back, like 2006, 7, when Bill was first starting to get it going. I was involved in Bill's Donut Mash and some of the early classes that were held in Northern California. And it's just been wonderful to see the the success and the growth of the ADI and the commitment to education and the commitment to keeping everybody together and informed from your platform. So I'm really grateful to you guys and really happy that the success continues with the membership that you have. Thank you.
There's no better note to end on than that one right there, right? So thank you so much for the kind words. Everyone, like again, have a great week, have a great weekend. Thank you for joining us, and check out our other webinars on our event page on distilling.com. I'll talk to you all later. Thank you, Denise.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.